The dining room glowed beneath the chandelier's warm golden light, every polished crystal and silver fork reflecting a kind of perfection that felt almost staged, as though the night had been designed to showcase the best parts of my family while quietly erasing the worst parts of me. And as I stepped inside with my carefully chosen dress, nothing too fancy, nothing too simple, just enough to say I tried, and the bottle of wine I had bought with money that should have gone toward groceries. I told myself over and over again that tonight might finally be the night they would see me, not as the background shadow I had always been, but as someone worth listening to, worth acknowledging, worth loving. Yet even as that fragile hope flickered in me, it began to crumble the moment my sister Clara's eyes found mine across the table, her lips curling into that triumphant smirk she had worn since childhood whenever she felt superior, which was almost always, because in her world she was the golden child, the flawless daughter, the star everyone adored, while I was the one who tripped in the shadows, forever reaching and never quite touching the light. I hadn't even placed the wine on the table before she leaned forward, her words sharp and venomous, though wrapped in sugar for the family's benefit, whispering just loud enough for our cousins and aunts and uncles to hear. Try not to embarrass yourself tonight. And though I forced a smile, pretending not to care, the words lodged themselves under my skin like thorns, drawing invisible blood. And as I sat down at the far side of the table, I watched the familiar performance unfold, my parents beaming with pride at Clara as she launched into her list of accomplishments, how she had been promoted at work, how she had just purchased a luxury condo in the city, how her fiancé had surprised her with a diamond ring so brilliant that it seemed to glow under the lights, and every boast felt like a dagger being twisted deeper into my chest, because I knew, as I always knew, that my family measured success by Clara's yardstick, and by that measure I had always been a disappointment. Still, when my father finally turned his gaze toward me, his voice rough but not unkind as he asked, "So, what's new with you?" I felt a surge of relief, a spark of hope, because at last it was my turn, my chance to share something. And I opened my mouth to tell them about the design firm that had hired me after months of rejection, the small victory that meant so much to me. But before a single word could form, Clara's mocking laughter cut through the room like glass shattering, her voice bright and cruel as she announced, "She works part-time, Dad. Don't get too excited. It's not like she's doing anything important." And just like that, the moment I had been holding on to, the fragile dream that maybe they would finally see me, collapsed into dust, leaving me choking on humiliation while laughter rippled around the table, cousins chuckling nervously, uncles hiding smiles behind their hands, even my mother refusing to meet my eyes as though agreeing with Clara's dismissal. And though my cheeks burned with heat and shame, I tried to steady my voice, tried to explain that it was a good opportunity, that it might lead to something permanent. But Clara wasn't finished with her performance, oh no. She leaned back in her chair with a theatrical sigh, her wine glass dangling from her fingers as she added, "Honestly, maybe you should just marry rich. Sis, it's the only way you'll ever live decently." And her words hit me harder than I expected, because they carried not just her judgment, but the silent approval of everyone who didn't correct her, everyone who let her cruelty hang in the air as if it were truth. The room went still after that, my mother adjusting her napkin with studied indifference, my father lifting his glass to his lips and pretending he hadn't heard. And in that silence, my humiliation grew unbearable, a wildfire consuming every ounce of dignity I had left. So I pushed back my chair, my voice trembling as I murmured an excuse to leave. But Clara, never satisfied until she had completely destroyed me, shoved her chair back to block my path, her eyes gleaming with triumph as she sneered, "No, don't leave yet. You always storm off when things get uncomfortable. You can't even handle dinner like an adult." And though I wanted to scream, wanted to claw back the dignity she had stolen from me, I froze, my throat closing around the lump of tears I refused to shed in front of her. But she wasn't done. She stood, tall and commanding, her hand latching onto my arm in a grip that was both possessive and degrading. And with a sudden shove, she pushed me toward the door, her voice sharp and merciless as she declared, "Get out of my house if you can't take a joke." And in that moment, the scrape of my heels across the wooden floor sounded louder than any insult. The clatter of the wine bottle slipping from my hand and crashing onto the ground sent crimson liquid and glass shards scattering like pieces of my shattered pride. And as I stood there trembling, eyes stinging, chest heaving, just waiting for someone, anyone to intervene, to tell her she had gone too far, I realized with soul-crushing clarity that no one was coming. Not my parents, who sat frozen with discomfort they would never turn into action. Not my cousins, who avoided my gaze. Not my uncles or aunts, who looked down at their plates as if studying the grains of rice could save them from choosing sides. And in that silence, heavier than any shout, I understood exactly what I meant to them. Nothing. Expendable, a burden they would rather ignore than defend. So I straightened, though my knees shook, and I walked out, not as someone leaving a dinner, but as someone being discarded like garbage, the cold night air rushing against my burning face as the door clicked shut behind me, and though tears finally spilled, streaking down my cheeks. Beneath the grief and humiliation there was something else, something sharp and unyielding. A voice in my chest whispering through trembling lips. This is the last time she humiliates me. This is the last time they laugh at me. This is the last time they treat me like nothing. Because one day I will rise, and when I do, she will regret this night, they all will. The days after that humiliating dinner pressed down on me like a suffocating weight, each morning dragging me back into the memory of Clara's sneer, the sting of her shove, the echo of shattered glass and laughter that wasn't really laughter, but silence dressed in cruelty. And I found myself replaying every detail as if my mind were determined to torture me. My tears soaking into the pillow until even crying felt empty. But somewhere in the fog of that despair, a spark began to burn, fragile yet relentless, whispering that I had two choices. Stay broken, a discarded sister defined by humiliation, or rebuild myself into something no one could dismiss. And with every breath I took in the lonely quiet of my small apartment. I chose the latter because pain, I learned, has a strange alchemy. It can destroy you or it can forge you. And I was done being destroyed. So I threw myself into work at the design firm, where I had only just been hired, arriving before the lights were switched on, staying long after the cleaning staff left, pushing myself to learn every program, every skill, every hidden detail that others ignored, volunteering for tasks no one wanted, taking notes in meetings until my wrists ached, and though exhaustion gnawed at me, each late night was a stone laid in the foundation of something greater, and slowly people noticed. Senior managers who had never spoken to me began to nod with approval. Colleagues sought my advice. Clients requested me by name. And within 6 months I was promoted not once but twice. A meteoric rise that even startled me. But I kept moving, driven not by pride, but by a hunger to prove that Clara's words, that I was useless, that I was nothing, were lies. And the more I grew, the more I began to hear whispers about Clara herself. Whispers carried through extended family gatherings, through social media posts, through the cracks in her carefully curated image, that her perfect life wasn't quite so perfect after all, that the fiancé who had once flaunted her on his arm was spotted late at night with someone else, that the luxury condo she posted about endlessly was mortgaged to the hilt, that the promotion she had bragged about came not from merit, but from favoritism. And though she continued to plaster her social feeds with pictures of lavish dinners, glossy handbags, and vacations meant to scream success, I knew, the cracks were widening, and all it would take was the right pressure for the facade to shatter. Fate, as though it too had been waiting, handed me that chance one ordinary afternoon when my boss called me into his glass-walled office, the city skyline glittering behind him as he told me our firm had been shortlisted for a massive contract with a luxury brand, the kind of deal that could change the trajectory of the company, and he wanted me to lead the project. My heart soaring at the validation until he mentioned the catch. The brand had ties to Clara's fiancé's company, a company I knew from my research was struggling, drowning in debt, desperate for this very contract to stay afloat. And as I left his office, file in hand, my pulse raced with a mix of dread and exhilaration, because here it was, the moment the universe had laid at my feet, a chance not just to succeed but to tilt the balance, to show Clara that the sister she had pushed out like trash was the very one who could pull the rug from under her glittering life. The night before the pitch, I sat in my apartment with every document spread across my table, researching until dawn, uncovering details of her fiancé's firm's weaknesses, their overextended loans, their inflated promises, their reliance on this one opportunity, and by the time the sun painted the horizon, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Deliver a pitch so flawless that the choice would be undeniable, so convincing that the contract would be ours and theirs would crumble. The next morning, as I stood in the boardroom before a panel of executives, the slides glowing behind me like a stage spotlight, I felt a calmness I had never known. My hands steady, my voice firm, Every design choice, every financial projection sharpened with precision. And as I spoke, I saw nods, smiles, the subtle signals of approval. And when I finished, there was a silence, the good kind, the kind that holds weight before the applause came, light but genuine, and in that moment I knew I had done it. Days later, the news came officially. The contract was ours, the victory sealed, and with it came the beginning of Clara's unraveling. Because without that contract, her fiancé's company collapsed into scandal and bankruptcy. The glossy ring she had flaunted vanished as their engagement dissolved quietly. The condo payments she had barely managed became impossible, and word spread quickly through the family grapevine, whispers shifting not about me this time, but about her, about Clara, the golden child with tarnished gold. The sister who had once humiliated me now stumbling under the weight of her own pride. And though I could have gloated, though I could have thrown her words back at her, I didn't need to. Because the beauty of it was that I hadn't lifted a finger against her. Her downfall was the inevitable result of her arrogance, her cruelty, her obsession with image over substance. And as I watched her carefully constructed life collapse, a strange calm settled over me. Not the glee of revenge, but the deep satisfaction of justice. Yet even as I savored the shift, I knew I wasn't finished. Because this wasn't just about her losing, it was about me becoming, me stepping into the power I had been denied, the respect I had been starved of, and so I pushed forward, taking on more projects, rising higher, earning not just promotions but recognition in industry circles, until my name began to carry weight, until invitations to panels and conferences arrived in my inbox, until I could stand in a room and no one would dare dismiss me. And with every step, I imagined Clara watching, imagined her scrolling through my achievements, imagined her seething as the narrative flipped, as the sister she had once shoved out of her house was now being welcomed into rooms she herself could only dream of. And in those moments, I didn't just feel vindicated. I felt unstoppable. Because I had risen from the ashes of her cruelty, and I was only just beginning. Months had passed since the night Clara humiliated me, months that felt like both a lifetime and a heartbeat. Because though the wounds she inflicted had scarred deeply, the fire they lit within me had carried me farther than I ever imagined. And by the time another family dinner invitation arrived, tucked into the family group chat as casually as if the last gathering hadn't ended in my disgrace, I was no longer the same trembling woman who had been shoved out like trash, but someone forged stronger, someone who had risen in silence. And though part of me wanted to decline, to avoid the risk of reopening old wounds, another part of me, the stronger part, knew this was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment to return not as the victim but as the victor. So I accepted. And when the evening came, I dressed deliberately, sliding into a sleek black dress that draped elegantly over my frame, slipping on heels that clicked with authority. And as I applied the final touch of lipstick, I didn't just see myself in the mirror. I saw the woman I had become. Confident, self-made, untouchable. The drive over felt like the longest walk of my life, every mile taking me closer to the house where my humiliation had once echoed. But as I stepped through the doorway, I felt no fear, only a steady calm. And the moment I entered the dining room, conversation faltered. Forks paused midair, eyes lifted toward me, and for the first time in my life, silence fell not because I had embarrassed them, but because I commanded the room. Even my mother, who rarely offered me more than a nod, blinked with something like pride flickering in her eyes. And my father straightened as though suddenly aware of my presence in a way he had never been before. Then my gaze found Clara, seated at the center of the table as always. But her smile was brittle, her eyes shadowed, her aura dimmed, and I knew before a word was spoken that her life had not recovered. The golden glow she once carried having dulled into something tired and desperate, and though she raised her glass in a mock toast at my arrival, the tremor in her hand betrayed her, as though even she understood that the dynamic between us had shifted irreversibly. Dinner began, the usual clatter of plates and murmurs of conversation filling the room. But this time, instead of her dominating the conversation with boastful tales of her promotions or glamorous vacations, Clara mumbled half-heartedly about restructuring at work, her words heavy with dread, her voice lacking its usual sparkle. And when my father sighed, disappointment etched across his face, and my mother avoided her eyes, I almost pitied her, almost, until I remembered the night she had shoved me toward the door while everyone watched, and the pity evaporated into a cold satisfaction. Then came the question that changed everything. as my uncle leaned forward, his eyes curious, his voice kind as he asked me, "So, how's work treating you?" And in that instant, the room shifted, all eyes turning toward me, waiting, listening, and I smiled softly, savoring the weight of the moment. My voice calm but strong as I said, "It's been wonderful. I recently led a project that brought in one of the biggest contracts our firm has ever secured. The recognition has been overwhelming. I've just been offered a director position." And before the words had even fully settled, the table erupted, cousins clapping me on the back, aunts congratulating me, my father's face lighting up with pride I had never seen directed at me, my mother clapping her hands together as though the daughter she had once ignored was suddenly the star. And in that swell of praise, I felt Clara's eyes burning into me, her fork trembling against her plate, the envy radiating from her so thick it was almost tangible, and I let it wash over me, let it soak into the wounds she had left, turning them into victories. But envy has a way of festering, and as the meal continued, as laughter and conversation flowed around me with a warmth I had once longed for, I saw Clara unraveling, her jaw tightening, her eyes darting, her wine glass emptying faster than usual, until finally, as dessert was served and the table once again buzzed with congratulations for me, she snapped, her voice sharp and shrill as she spat, "Oh, so now everyone thinks she's the successful one? Please, she just got lucky. She's still the same useless sister she's always been." And for a heartbeat the room froze. But this time the silence didn't fall on me. It fell on her, heavy and suffocating as my father's face hardened, his voice cutting through the tension with a firmness I had never heard from him before as he said, "Enough, Clara. Don't belittle your sister. She's worked hard and we're proud of her." And when my mother, who had so often remained silent, added in a soft but steady whisper, "You could learn a thing or two from her resilience," Clara's face crumbled, red with rage and shame, her eyes darting around the table in desperate search for someone, anyone to defend her, but no one spoke. The same family who had once turned their backs on me now turning their backs on her. And in that crushing silence, I leaned forward, my voice calm but cutting, each word deliberate as I said, "Funny how things change, isn't it? Once you threw me out of this very house like trash, but tonight, it seems the only one throwing themselves away is you." And the moment the words left my lips, her fork clattered against her plate, tears welling in her eyes. The mighty Clara brought low not by my vengeance, but by the weight of her own actions. And for the first time in my life, I stood at that table not to leave in shame. Not to be cast out, but to be embraced. As my family gathered around me, their arms warm, their words kind, lifting me up in a way I had never known, while Clara sat alone, her shoulders hunched, humiliated, forced to taste the very poison she had once fed me. And in that moment, as laughter returned, as pride radiated around me, I realized that revenge hadn't come through cruelty or schemes, but through resilience, through rising when they expected me to fall, through becoming everything they said I could never be. And as I looked at Clara across the table, tears streaking her face, I felt no hatred, only a deep, unwavering certainty that she had created her own downfall, and that I had finally, irrevocably, won.